In this unit, we'll explore isometric illustration. This is a type of illustration drawn in perspective using the perspective grid tool. This is a network of lines drawn to represent the perspective. Let me show you how it works. Firstly, you'll need to access the perspective grid tool, which is right here. You will get a graph like this, which at first glance it might feel really unfamiliar. But if you check it again and imagine this part here, the middle part, as a building in a street corner actually, you will notice that it starts feeling a bit more familiar. It's kind of like your road on the left, a road on the right, and then you have this huge building in front of you sitting. So it feels like the actual perspective that you will see in a city. And that's exactly how it works. So we have this grid that allows us to draw on the different side of the perspective in order to create an illustration that feels three-dimensional. More specifically, you will notice that you have all those handles here. We have firstly this horizontal line, which is actually the horizon line. So it's the level of the eyes of the viewer. We have the vanishing point, which is this one and that one there. And this point is usually the point that everything gets smaller and smaller as it goes towards that point. And that's also in the reality. If you have like a building here, the one next to it, it's going to feel slightly smaller, the one next to it a bit smaller, and so on, till they will get tiny far away in the perspective. We have this distance between these two horizontal lines, which is our horizon height. And the horizon height is the observer's eye level. Now you can notice that I can grab any of those points and define them. So I can change, for example, the horizon line height. I can move my whole perspective grid up and down by grabbing the ground level line. And I can adjust the height of my grid if I want to, which is just a difference in how you view the grid. It's not gonna make any big difference the outcome. We have also those points that we can actually move, the vanishing points. But in general, I would suggest to keep it as close as possible to the original, especially if you're not aware of what exactly the grid represents yet, because you might end up in perspective outcomes that they feel really unnatural. What you can also do is further adjust your grid by going to View and then Perspective Grid and Define Grid. From that panel here, you can define the type of your grid. So if you want a one-point perspective grid, so I'm going to just click to apply to see, which is similar to the previous one, but the one-point perspective is a drawing method that shows how things appear to get smaller as they get farther away. So converting towards a single vanishing point on the horizon line. So we have only one point that everything tends to get smaller as you go towards to. Then we have also the 3-point perspective. And you will see that we have 3 vanishing points at this time, 2 on this horizon line and 1 on a vertical line. Let's jump back to our 2-point perspective grid, which is also the most usual one. And it's the one that we started with. So the 2-point contains 2 vanishing points on the horizon line. On that panel though, you can go ahead and define a few further options, such as the units that you want to use, the scale of your drawing, and how many grid lines you want to have between how many points, so you can be really precise about the details of your drawing. You can also change the viewing angle, so the angle that you're viewing things, the viewing distance, which is the distance between the observer and the scene, and then the horizon height, which is, as we mentioned, the observer's eye level. On the bottom part here, you can change the color of the grid that represents each of the sides of your drawing. And of course the opacity, so how transparent you want the grid to be. Once you're happy with all these settings, you just press OK in order to apply your transformation. So that's quite enough, I would say, with the theoretical knowledge. Let's go ahead and explore this perspective grid tool and see how we can actually practically work with that. As you can see here, I have this little indicator on the top left corner, which indicates a little square with 3 different sides. By clicking on each of the sides, I can define on which side I actually want to draw. What I'm gonna do is crop a rectangle and perhaps draw something like, let's do a staircase. What you will notice that if I draw a rectangle, it immediately snaps to the perspective. It's not becoming a proper rectangle as it would be when we were drawing it without the perspective. That is quite good. And then I'm gonna grab the second side. So I want to draw this part of the step, so the top part. So I need this surface, the green grid. I'm gonna go ahead and draw it here. Be careful, like when you're drawing it, make sure you draw it from the beginning on the right point. Because else, as you will notice, if you try to move it later on, it won't adjust to the perspective. So you have to go ahead and draw it straight away on the right direction and the right size. That feels good. I'm gonna do the next step. You draw different shapes on different directions, and it's up to you to make it work properly by drawing the shapes on the right position. I'm gonna extend the staircase towards the bottom part, since here we reach the point that you don't really see the top of the stair. That's why the perspective and everything feels a bit awkward. So let's go ahead and move towards the bottom part, which feels a bit more natural in terms of perspective. And a bit more interesting, I would say. Make sure you're having the snapped point option enabled, which you'll find under the view panel, so snap to point, and that is going to help you perfectly align your objects while drawing. So you see that automatically my shapes are actually snapping to the grid. Let's add also the other side that we want here. Let's do that part. So I'm drawing on the wrong side. I need the blue side in order to get my shape right here. And another one for this step. And you see how everything is actually snapping, so I don't need to pay too much attention on what I'm drawing. Now it's a bit too complicated to see what I draw because I have all this grid here behind. In order to disable the grid, you have to select the perspective grid tool and press the X button, this indicator there. And so it's gonna disappear. If you want to appear it again, you just click on the perspective grid tool and it's gonna stay exactly where it was. So I'm gonna close that and I'm gonna grab my illustration and move it. But be careful, if you decide to do so, make sure that you don't want to edit it any farther, because if I click now on the perspective grid tool, I took it out of the actual perspective, so I won't be able to further edit it based on that grid that I had before. Let's add a bit of color to see like what we created. Let's go ahead and make those sides of the steps. So I'm gonna grab all the sides. Let's remove the outline, we don't need it anymore. So you can see how easily we managed to create a lovely staircase, which we can further work on and further edit by adding like more shapes or like a background color as I'm doing at the moment. I'm gonna lock that, and you can play around. For example, like you can add like a little sphere. And make it feel like you have a little ball going down like the stairs or something. I'm using my gradient here to make the sphere look a bit more three-dimensional. And perhaps what it needs is also a little shadow, so it sits somewhere. I'm gonna make it black color. And you can also like play around and make it bounce. So I'm gonna do some copies of the sphere bouncing down the stairs. We're gonna show later on in the course also how to use the 3D tools in Adobe Illustrator, and perhaps in that case you could do even nicer like bouncing ball. Perhaps I'm gonna add also a little shadow there, and I'm gonna squeeze it since it will feel a bit more natural for the perspective. The perspective of the stairs feels a bit too much here because we went far towards the edge of the grid. So I would suggest you to perhaps in this case work on a smaller scale, which will make the perspective feel a bit more natural, closer to what we see with our bare eyes. So this is what isometric illustration is all about. In the next unit, I will show you the envelope distort and the free transform. Come with me.